Verse 26 says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.' And God said, 'Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food.' And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day." So, I have a PowerPoint. I know we don't usually use those in the Sunday morning sessions, but some of what I'm talking about this morning is quite complicated, and I've been working on it for like 3 months to try and make it simple, so I apologize if it's still not simple. Hopefully it's still useful for you. So as I said, this morning I want to continue this little series on Genesis 1 to 3. And if you remember back to the first two sessions, if you were here, we noted how the author of Genesis presents us in these first 6 days 2 main themes: the theme of ordered creation and fitting rulers. And you remember how these two themes operate in terms of the first 6 days of creation. In days 1, 2, and 3 of the creation week, God orders a previously disordered creation to establish a realm in which life can flourish. On day 1, he does this by ordering the darkness to establish a domain of cyclical light, and with it, the concept of time. On day 2, he orders the chaotic waters to establish water above and water below, and with it, the weather cycle. And on day 3, he orders a lifeless world by bringing dry, stable land from the waters below and causing it to bring forth the first life in the form of plants and fruit. Then in the second half of the creation week, we revisit each of those 3 domains in the exact same sequence. And this time, God fills each domain with a group of entities that are fit to rule over that realm in specific ways. On day 4, he sets the sun, the moon, and the stars to manage the sequence of life or light and time. And then on day 5, he sets the fish to fill and bring life to the seas below, and birds to fill and bring life to the waters above, or to the sky above. And then on day 6, he sets various kinds of animals the task of filling and bringing life to the dry ground. But just like the second part of God's work on day 3, or there are 2 parts to God's work on day 3, there's also a second part to his work on day 6. And here we find the second climax of those 6 days. We had one climax in the first side where fertile land could bring forth life. And then on the second side, we have a second climax, and this time the climax is humanity. And what this passage teaches us about humanity is fascinating and can really reinforce, I think, for us our meaning and purpose here on earth. As we work forward, I want to basically organize my thoughts under 3 containers. The first container contains one general but significant question: who is this passage referring to? Then the second container will focus on a discussion of the 3 descriptive features that this passage assigns to humanity. And then the third container will focus on the 4 ways which God desires humanity to rule over his ordered and life-filled creation. And at the very end, if you haven't fallen asleep, I'll try to wrap it all up by applying it to our practical lives in the modern world. So let's deal with the first container by asking ourselves the question: who is this passage talking about? Now, you might think to yourself, isn't that kind of obvious? The text is referring to Adam and Eve, the creation of the first man and woman. It's referring to the first two humans. But I'd encourage you to slow down a little bit there. We will get to the creation of Adam and Eve in the second creation story. But the fitting ruler who God sets over the whole of creation in this story is not specified by name as Adam and Eve, but rather, I think it's significant that it's humanity as a group. Let me enhance this argument by referring you to what Genesis 1 says about the previous days of God setting fitting rulers over various domains. I've put up on the board the different groups that we have and the prime suspect, the quintessential animal from each of those groups. So I put the pug for the land animals, the best animal ever to have been created. Just like birds, fish, cattle, wild animals, and small animals were called in their entire groups to serve as fitting rulers within the realm God put them, so too is humanity described as a whole here and called together to the same functions. So I hope what I'm arguing there is clear enough to grasp hold of. Genesis 1's presentation of the first creation of humans refers to the creation of humanity as a group. And why do I think it's important to get that right from the very beginning? Well, I think that this point is significant as we work through the contents of the next two containers of this talk. As we consider the rest of the text, we will see that it discusses humanity's characteristics and callings. And because it is discussing humanity as a whole, we can be sure up front that every characteristic and every calling is true of all humans everywhere, including you as an individual. So with the content of the first container then sufficiently dealt with, let's move on to work through the content of the second container. In this section of my talk, I want to point out and explore three characteristics the author of Genesis assigns to humanity. And the first of these is discussed in verse 26 and then again in 27. Here, humanity is said to be made in the image of God. Now, I need to spend a little bit of time on this point because the concept of humanity as the image of God, I think, is maybe one of the top 10 most significant ideas in the whole of the Bible. Let me just give you a few seconds then to think about how you would define this concept of the image of God. What do you think it means that humanity is made in God's image? I tried this out, and I think that most people instinctively say something like this. Being made in the image of God is to possess some of the same characteristics as God has. You might note things like the ability to reason, to love, to communicate, to think about ourselves and the world around us as evidence that we are made in the image of God. And I think that's a good start. But as we'll see in the next couple of minutes, I think these things are actually closer to the second attribute this passage gives us, the idea of being made in God's likeness. These features of sharing God's characteristics and abilities are building blocks which kind of sit on a more foundational idea. And what is that idea? Well, I think the foundational idea upon which all the other elements of being made in the image of God is built upon is the idea of election. Now, we're already aware and probably a bit nervous of that term as part of New Testament debates about God's sovereignty. But my use of it here doesn't really enter into that space at all. Rather, when I speak about election here, the parallels I'm drawing to your mind are the election of Israel and of Jesus as people or people groups or people, individuals, through whom God chose to reveal himself to the world. And that reveal bit is important. Out of other nations, God elected Israel as a witness to his character on earth. And he says that throughout Scripture, and at multiple times in the prophets actually derides them for showing his character negatively to people in the world. And then out of all people, God elected Jesus to be his quintessential witness to his character on the earth. And John 17 and Hebrews 1 both reference this fact. Jesus reveals the Father. And in the same way, out of all the other parts of his creation that we're told about in this first creation story, God has elected humanity to be a witness to his character on the earth. All three of these elections were from a broader set of options. Jesus was elect out of a wider group of people. Israel was elect out of a wider group of nations. And in this case, humanity has been elect out of a wider group of created living beings. And all three of these elections were made by God's choice alone, and that is important. Because what I hope you can see from this is that the foundational idea of being made in the image of God is that God has elected humanity as a whole to be the part of his creation through which he will communicate himself in a specific way. Later, he would reveal and choose other people as to reveal himself in other specific ways. He would choose Israel to show himself, and then Jesus to show himself. But at this point in the story, at this early juncture, God has elected all humanity as his imagers or his revealers on the earth. Now, you might be happy with that explanation, but I just want to show you, or anybody that wants a little bit further justification for this position, how I think this strengthens a particular case that is probably dear to many of our hearts, the idea of being pro-life. If being made in the image of God is only about things on the top row there, about the ability to reason or to love or to communicate, to think about ourselves and the world around us, then we have a problem, because some humans can't do these things very well or at all. And specifically, if the image of God only refers to attributes or abilities, this poses a problem for those of us who are pro-life. Pro-lifers want to say that humans are made in God's image right from the very moment of conception. We want to say that the small single cell that has been formed at that point is not just a potential human, but is really fully human and is really made in God's image. But a zygote doesn't have the ability to reason, to love, to communicate, to think about itself and the world around it. Those things are only potentials at this stage of development. And for some people, it might never develop. So if being made in the image of God is all about features that you possess, then a zygote would only become the image of God at a later point when it had developed certain abilities. On the other hand, if the foundational idea of being made in the image of God is built on the foundation that humanity as a whole, as a group, has been elected as the group in which God has chosen to reveal his character, then this problem, it seems to me, is solved. If God's election of humanity as his image is the foundational idea of being made in the image of God, it ensures that we can state absolutely certainly that every human who has ever lived, no matter how big or how small, how old or how young, how smart or how disabled, is elected by God to serve as his image. There are no degrees in being made in the image of God. All humans are equally God's image. Indeed, as we'll see on the week where I talk about the effects of the fall on creation, this idea that I've just explained helps us to see quite clearly why even after the fall, we can continue to be described as made in the image of God. For God can reveal himself even in those who oppose his will. And so on that foundation, I think we can build the other two descriptions we find in this passage in their proper place. God has elected humanity to reveal himself in a specific way. And he has given us the ability to do this accurately because we are, as verse 26 says, made in his likeness. And this is where attributes and abilities come in much more naturally. Humanity by design is a faithful and adequate representation of God. We are made in his likeness in many ways. We are living beings like he is. We are part spirit like he is. Well, he's full spirit, but we are part spirit. We're able to reason, love, communicate, and think about ourselves like he does. We can interact with time and space and matter like he does. We can take material and use our imaginations to reform it into new and inventive creations just like he does. And although we'll all display his likeness in various ways with different abilities and areas of focus, all humans continue to be part of this elect group whom God has chosen to reveal his character through. And then we'll look briefly at the third descriptor which this text assigns to humanity. In verse 27, humanity is said from the beginning to be made male and female. Why two parts? Well, later in Scripture, God himself reveals that his inner self is made up of three persons existing in one Godhead. We're not going to get into that now, but we would expect if a God is complex like our God is, then his creatures would be made in such a way to reflect that complex and diversity within our God. We would likewise display diversity in our essential nature. And that's exactly what we find in reality. Humanity is made male and female. We are made diverse, as this passage affirms. But it is still important to note that it doesn't matter for the rest of what's said here, whether you're XX or XY, because everything else that is said in this first creation story in relation to humanity is made towards all humans as their entire group. So before I move on to look at the callings of humanity, let me try to draw together the ideas of being made in God's image and his likeness with an illustration. The concept of being made in the likeness of a God is drawn from the religious world which would have surrounded the ancient Israelites. And I found it helpful to try and compare how they would have thought, maybe with the example of an idol in a temple to Zeus compared with humanity as an image of God. If you don't find this helpful, just ignore it if it finds a bit strange to you. But I think found it quite helpful for myself because it's probably what was in their mind. So imagine for a minute an idol sitting in a temple to Zeus. This idol has been designed by the priests and placed there as the place in which Zeus worshippers should come and pray and sacrifice to Zeus. And in that sense, the idol has been elected as the image of Zeus. When the worshippers are in the presence of the idol, they're expected to experience Zeus in a special way. So we can see that that idol is an image to Zeus. But it's not just an image. The priests have carved the idol and decorated it in a specific way so it actually looks like Zeus. It's made of gold. It's holding a staff and a bolt of lightning. It sits on a throne and it has a snarl on its face. In this sense, the idol is made in Zeus's likeness. And of course, no one's saying that it's Zeus himself. It's only been elected as the object through which Zeus worshippers can come to see what Zeus is like and gain closeness to him. That's a very poor illustration, but I think it's a kind of picture it seems to be that what the ancient people would have been thinking about. They would have imagined humanity as a kind of idol, not made from wood or stone. God himself tells them often that he can't be represented through the elements of the world or through animals. Rather, he has chosen to reveal himself in living human beings wandering around the world. Humanity has been designed by God as the people through which he will reveal himself. And just like the Zeus idol was elected as the image of Zeus, humanity has been elected as the image of God. So that when you're in the presence of human, you have access in some sense to God's revealed character in a special way. And God has carved humanity so that we actually look like him, not physically, but in attributes. He has made us with many characteristics that he possesses so that we can properly be described as being in God's likeness. And of course, humanity is not God. We have simply been elected as the object through which God can reveal his character. So hopefully you can see how those two ideas interact. Humanity has been elected by God as the group through which he images himself to the world. And humanity has been carefully and specially sculpted by God so that we have the capacity and features necessary to actually be described as like God. So now we've covered the first two sections of my talk. Sorry, you didn't see that second half. There's meant to be a comparison there, but yeah, I'll give you the slides afterwards if you want to see them. So we've covered the first two sections, so let's move on to look at the four callings that God gives to humanity as a group. In verse 28, the first and second callings of humanity are the same as those given to the fish and the birds and the land animals. So humanity is called to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. And I said a number of months ago in my first two talks that these terms include the idea of God tasking his creatures with dispensing his goodness to the whole world as they produce more of themselves. I don't have time to spend more on those terms because we already covered them in quite a bit of detail in those previous talks. Rather, let's just turn now to look in more detail at the two unique callings which God gives to humanity in this section. And I'm probably not going to hit 5 past. Let's go for 10. Sorry. First, we are to subdue the earth, and second, we are to rule over fish, birds, cattle, and all the rest of God's creation on his behalf. So let's talk about what it means to subdue the earth. The word subdue is defined as follows, and this might be a little bit surprising. To bring into bondage, to trample underfoot, to make subservient, to keep under control. You might think to yourself, what? Why would humanity in this pre-fall state need God's instruction to bring the earth under bondage, to make it subservient? Isn't the world already said to be under God's control? Well, let me try and explain how this makes sense in terms of what has been happening in the creation week thus far. We saw that the original state in verse 2 of chapter 1 was a universe that is dark, chaotic, lifeless, and disordered. And so in the first half of the week, God establishes order by bringing light, stability, and potential for sustaining life. He overdoes all of that original state. And then in the second half, God handed over these ordered realms to the control of his fitting rulers. The sun, the moon, and the stars, the sea, the sky, and the land animals are all set over specific domains to fill them and to bring blessing to them. But then at the very end, God does something really significant. He hands over the task of maintaining order of the whole earth to humanity. For God to task humanity with subduing the earth contains within it the idea that there was still some work to be done. God has done the initial work of bringing light to darkness, stability to chaos, potential for life from lifelessness, and he says it is very good. Yet he seems to say at the same time that part of his plan for humanity is to continue that ordering work by giving them the task of ensuring that God's order is established at every point and maintained for times on end. I guess you could say that God has purposely brought creation up to a certain point of order so that he could hand responsibility of maintaining and spreading that order universally. And it's the same basic idea that is extended to the animal realm in the fourth description of what God says. Humans should rule over the fish, the birds, and the land animals. And this term rule can almost be translated as have dominion over, or has the meaning of exercising authority or keeping under control. So in this first or fourth calling, humanity is handed the responsibility of maintaining order in the animal kingdom on God's behalf. God has established the initial state of order in these realms, but humanity is handed the responsibility of reigning on God's behalf and continuing what he started. So let's summarize this and bring it all down to an application for our lives today. What we learn in this section is that humanity stands at the climax of God's whole creation. We as a group are made by God with a special and high calling. We are elected as his image bearers, the people through whom he will most clearly reveal himself. We are made in his likeness and with the ability to display his character and relate to him in real and significant ways. And both as male and female, together we are called by God as his kings and queens on the earth. He has given us 4 specific tasks of making more of ourselves, of spreading his blessing to the world, of maintaining order that he has established on the earth, and maintaining order that he has established in the animal kingdom. And these callings remain part of our lives today. They are part of why you, a small cog in the whole human machine, are alive. None of these features or responsibilities has been done away with. They are active, and we should be seeking to do our bit to carry them out in the spheres we have influence over. In many ways, the whole of the rest of the Bible, the biblical story after Genesis 1, is telling us how God has revealed himself through these people that he elected as his image bearers. But to flesh out that kind of idea would probably take the whole time I've already done over again. So let me quickly apply what we've been thinking about to 3 areas where you can probably talk through more. It's pretty much an outline. There's so much could be said here and so many other things that I could have mentioned. So first, I think this passage teaches us something about how we should be working together for the good of God's creation. The world that we live in is God's world. It has been tainted by the fall and by human rebellion. However, God has never taken away his election of humanity as the fitting rulers through whom he wants to establish order on the earth. And so I think that this teaching might inform how we interact with subjects like politics, education, social service, work, as well as a whole other host of areas. I'm not going to tell you how, I'm just saying that it might. God cares about how humanity as a whole carries out his election and calling. And so we should be voices calling humans to live in sync with what they really are. Then let's apply the ideas to something that might be a little mundane, gardening and litter picking for the glory of God. When you plant a flower or cut your grass or pull out your weeds from the sidewalk in front of Apsley, you're carrying out in a small way your calling to subdue the earth. When you recycle your plastic, put your leftovers in the bin and pick up the cardboard that has been blowing around your street since the last time the recycling people were meant to come and get it, you're carrying out your calling to bring order to God's creation. I'll leave you to think through other areas where that applies. But finally, I just want to encourage you to, in light of this passage, to be resolutely pro-life, from conception, in weakness, through suffering, to the grave. Humanity as a whole has been elected as a group through whom he will reveal himself clearly. And even on the other side of the fall, every time a new human is formed, that small, helpless cell cluster is part of the group over which God says, "This is my image." When you see those who are weak in mind or body, those who are suffering physically or spiritually, those who the world would discard in a heartbeat, the downtrodden, the outcast, the drug addicts, the single mums, every single human you come into contact with is part of the group over whom God has said, "This is my image." And even though most people I've noticed in the previous list are touched by the fall, being affected by their own sin or the sin of others, they continue to be part of the group through whom God says, "I will reveal myself through you." And how do we know that? How do we know for sure God is still committed to revealing himself through them or through you? Well, the supper that we came together to share this morning declares this for us most clearly. The incarnation and the cross stand as the most potent revelation of God's character in and through a human, Jesus the Messiah. God is still committed today to displaying himself through his election of humanity as his image. And this is true whether he is showing his positive or his negative attributes towards people on account of what they have done. God will respect the autonomy of those who want to rebel against him, and he will reveal himself in wrath against those who are the pharaohs of this world. But in Jesus, we see that God's deepest desire is to show himself in love and grace towards his image bearers. This is the reason why he made us in the first place. So value life, protect it. Do not treat what God treats precious as trite. Let me just finish. I'm really sorry for going over, but let me finish with a quote from Dana Ortland to illustrate all of this. God made the world so that his son's heart had an outlet. We don't use the word like benevolence much today. It means a disposition to be kind and good, a crouched coil of compassion ready to spring. Picture a dammed up river, pent, engorged, ready to burst forth. That is the kindness in the heart of Christ. He is infinitely benevolent, and human history is his opportunity to open and pour forth all that immense fountain of condensation, love, and grace. The creation of the world and the ruinous fall into sin that called for a recreative work undammed the heart of Christ. And Christ's heart flood is how God's glory surges forth further and brighter than ever it could other wives. Thanks.